Welcome and thank you for coming back to TADHack Global 2017. I'm Jason Lowe from Oracle here at QUT. The space at QUT is sponsored by Oracle Foundry and Oracle. I have my next speaker, Dr. Matthew Rimmer. Nice to meet you.
G'day, how you going?
Interesting, yeah, fantastic. We had some great speakers this morning. We just had Dr. Monique Mann around talking about, from School of Justice, talking about law surveillance, privacy, law enforcement, lots of really good content there. We had a few speakers around security and application development. We've had drones. We've had lots of really good speakers this morning. So glad that you can actually come along to TADHack and discuss about what you do.
Great to be here, particularly being a professor at QUT who does work on intellectual property and innovation law, and we have to kind of cut across a wide range of different regulatory fields, but telecommunications is a particular obsession of ours.
So just as an introduction, let me get this right, Intellectual Property and Innovation Law Research Program. What is that?
We have about a dozen researchers who work across international trade and sustainable development, all the various dimensions of intellectual property, copyright, trademarks, patents, trade secrets. We look at media and communications law. We look at innovation law, particularly a lot of work on 3D printing and robotics and biometrics. We also do a lot of work on open data, open access and open innovation. So we host Creative Commons Australia at QUT, which provide open licenses to kind of enable access to various sorts of innovations and creative works. So we cover a wide range of territory.
That's quite, yeah, as you said, quite a big range in territory in terms of that field. I'm just questioning, one of the things that when Angela sort of say, hey, why can't we get Dr. Matthew Rimmer on and talk about net neutrality, and then start looking at some of your older ABC radio interviews around that space. So it's quite a big thing that we need to be talking about.
Well, network neutrality is a really interesting concept. I mean, some of you may be familiar with it, and some of you might be unfamiliar with the concept. Particularly in Australia, it's quite curious that network neutrality hasn't really evolved and developed the way it has in other jurisdictions. But really, Professor Timothy Wu from Columbia University coined the phrase network neutrality, and he's a historian of media and the law, and he was very kind of concerned about the historical pattern of monopolisation of various different media platforms like radio and television, and he was very kind of concerned that there would be similar trends in relation to telecommunications and the internet. So he was very kind of interested in trying to develop some new doctrinal concepts to try to ensure that there would be a free and open internet. And he was very kind of interested in the notion of a common carrier in relation to telecommunications. So he was thinking about ways in which to stop the problem of broadband discrimination. And he kind of coined the phrase network neutrality to kind of capture that concept. And over the past 2 decades, it's been fascinating to see that quite abstract philosophical discussion really become institutionalised in some leading jurisdictions. After some hesitation and equivocation, President Barack Obama did embed network neutrality into the Federal Communications Commission system. But the new President Donald Trump, as part of his deregulatory agenda, seems to be trying to deconstruct the rules in relation to network neutrality. But the idea has kind of migrated to other jurisdictions as well. So at QUT we had a great event on digital transactions in Asia, and a quite lively discussion about the concept of network neutrality in India, particularly with the Facebook Basics program. So it's interesting to see how network neutrality has informed other discussions. And in Australia, it's kind of had a shadow presence. There's been a great deal of concern in Australia about the slow internet speeds that exist, particularly with the halting, frustrated rollout of the National Broadband Network. So there's this emerging discussion about network neutrality in Australia.
So when we look at that, one of the things I've been asking most of the speakers is roles and responsibilities within, whether it be government, whether it be corporates, public sector, even down to the individual resident. And what are the responsibilities that we will have as part of that community?
Well, network neutrality matters, not in terms of just being merely a kind of an abstract concept, but it's also connected to larger debates about freedom of speech and human rights, about competition and consumer rights, but also about innovation and entrepreneurial activity. So the last speaker, Dr. Monique Mann, kind of talked about the importance of human rights in the digital era.
Yeah.
Amongst other things, network neutrality might help enable freedom of speech and human rights in the internet by ensuring democratic participation on the internet. A wider range of voices can potentially be heard. So some of the key defenders and advocates for network neutrality, like Senator Al Franken, former comedian, current Democrat, has said that freedom of speech is foundational for a lot of other freedoms, and network neutrality is very much bound up with providing platforms to enable freedom of speech. So that's kind of really important and significant in terms of enabling access to the internet to enable discussions about all sorts of matters. So it's been interesting that a lot of civil society groups like the American Civil Liberties Union and the Electronic Frontier Foundation have been supporters of network neutrality, as have environmental groups like Greenpeace, and the Black Lives Matter movement has kind of been very kind of concerned about it as well. So it's interesting that network neutrality kind of leads into this larger discussion about freedom in an age of digital communication. But really network neutrality also has great implications for industry as well. So the kind of concern has been that network neutrality is a means of ensuring an even playing field between small startups and much more established players and some of the big conglomerates that exist and some of the old legacy industries, particularly some of the copyright industries around publishing and music and film. So network neutrality is a means of trying to ensure an even playing field, and particularly to ensure that some of the big cable providers don't abuse their market power by, for instance, having fast lanes and slow lanes on the internet, fast lanes for their own services or those services in which they have some sort of reciprocal financial arrangement, and slow services for competitors and rivals. So it's been interesting that in the debate over network neutrality in the United States, a lot of startups have been supporters of network neutrality because they see that that's essential in terms of the innovation ecosystem for them to have a fair chance to survive and flourish and not be knocked out by more well-established players. But really it's also a larger debate about competition and consumer rights as well, and ensuring that consumers on the internet get a fair deal and are not subject to throttling, blocking or slowing of the internet, but also ensuring that there's some transparency about what is happening on the internet, that there are open, transparent and accountable rules. So there was a lot of litigation in the United States over throttling in relation to the use of torrent services, not necessarily in a very transparent way. So network neutrality is also designed to ensure that consumers benefit from a fair and open playing field as well, and also that the larger environment is one that ensures in relation to internet speeds and internet pricing, they get a fair go.
So it's interesting when you talk about that fair and that common infrastructure, so to speak, around that. One of the things that we've got as part of the challenges today as part of TADHack is actually focusing on remote communities and telecommunications out there. Second one being more about similar to a My Health record for people that can't get to a doctor every day, but still providing extended health services to those people. So I assume that there's other impacts of having that net neutrality as that foundation?
Well, network neutrality certainly kind of animates the kind of larger discussion debate about the digital divide, particularly with rural and remote communities, but also in terms of rural and remote innovation as well. So there's been a great deal of concern in the United States that rural and remote areas lack competition in relation to internet and telecommunication services, and that has been quite harmful in a variety of different ways. So one of the reasons for network neutrality is to try to ensure a way to overcome some of the old inequalities in relation to the digital divide. But it's also kind of a question of ensuring that there are opportunities for innovation in those regions as well. We've certainly had parallel debates in Australia. In Queensland, we've had a bit of a problem with the drought at the moment in terms of climate change leading to an inordinately hot winter. But we've had some parallel problems with the data drought, particularly in rural and regional parts of Australia. And there have been problems with the rollout of the NBN, but also the kind of patchwork of other solutions like the Sky Muster, which was designed to try to provide better coverage. And there's a great discontent within rural and regional communities about the inequalities that exist there. And it's certainly evident. I mean, having family in rural and regional parts of Australia, plaintive cries of my daughter visiting Coonabarabran and northwest New South Wales, just in terms of the third-rate internet services that are available and the lack of proper Wi-Fi, the lack of proper coverage. It's very kind of striking. But even in urban parts of Australia, there are huge problems in terms of the adequacy of internet and broadband services. Even in inner city parts of Brisbane, there have been huge problems in terms of things like internet speeds. So, if Australia wants to have an ideas boom and boost its innovation and help our creative engineers and technicians and innovators, network neutrality is a means of helping achieve that goal. So I think if Malcolm Turnbull is kind of keen on boosting Australia's innovation, perhaps he needs to think about how network neutrality could play a role in boosting Australia's innovation capacity. And unfortunately, in terms of our debates over the new media law reforms, that was a topic that didn't really get an airing as it should. There has been a discussion that there'll be an inquiry into competition in the digital age, particularly looking at Google and Facebook as part of the deals done with Nick Xenophon. But to my mind, there's been a lack of hard action in terms of competition in Australia in relation to telecommunications and internet and broadband. There's been problems in relation to protecting consumer rights, but there's also really a need for a stronger doctrinal device to promote competition in Australia. So my frustration with the media law reform debates was that there was a recognition that our media laws are antiquated, but there was a real failure to invent and devise some new, well-adapted doctrines for the age of broadband.
I see. So a few weeks ago, I went to River Sea Labs, and Startup Catalyst actually came back from Israel, and they were talking about, as part of that mission there to Tel Aviv, they were taking all these AgTech type startups over there, and they actually talked about all the great opportunities and all the things that they've learned and bring that back. So there's definitely the opportunity there. There's definitely the drive to innovate in rural or agriculture, and definitely when we talk about telecommunications, that's definitely out there. We're not talking about central Sydney CBD areas. We're actually talking out, as you were saying, out.
There's a long history of rural and regional innovation in Australia. I used to belong to a centre that focused upon intellectual property and agriculture for 14 years. And historically in Australia, back in the 19th century, you had innovators like the Furphys in Shepparton, who would go around to agricultural fairs and show off their new agricultural machinery, including the famous water cart and threshers and other things. and they filed early kind of colonial patents. But these days, particularly for Australian farmers and rural and regional innovators, it's a very competitive environment. Australia needs to kind of add value in a variety of different ways. They do that in certain sorts of ways, but in relation to the combination of information technology and agriculture, I think there are a lot of opportunities, both in terms of using it as a means of communication, but also devising and inventing new products and new services. So I think there's a lot of potential there to improve performance. But, of course, it's also a means of kind of drawing new potential employers to regional and rural hubs in Australia if we kind of have stronger services. And you can see that, in New England, in Armidale, where, NBN had an early rollout,
Yes.
and the services were quite strong. I think that has been a kind of fillip for that particular regional centre. So there's a kind of some interesting questions about innovation and geography kind of being brought up by network neutrality as well, and overcoming some of the digital divides that exist. Because it's a hugely competitive environment, and you're quite right to say that some other jurisdictions have stolen a march on us,
Yeah.
like Finland and Estonia and Korea and Japan, who have heavily invested in high-speed broadband and internet services, and it has given them a competitive advantage in certain sorts of ways.
Yeah, there is that ad that I've seen on TV where there was a telecommunications provider saying, this is us in Australia in terms of that speed, and one of those European countries is way up here, and thinking, how can that be?
Well, the ACCC has become very angry about overclaiming by telecommunications providers, particularly around broadband speeds, kind of making audacious claims and failing to kind of deliver those services. So from their perspective, it's very important that telecommunications providers and internet service providers don't make misleading and deceptive claims and representations about their products and services. But it's a hugely kind of competitive space at the moment, and Australia needs to deliver on its promises of stronger, faster broadband if it's really going to be competitive with some of the superpowers that are out there who have been investing heavily in this area, but also some of the emerging high-tech nations as well. Because Australia will otherwise suffer from the tyranny of distance. And, in terms of the shift in relation to trade, that will be very significant. As a researcher who does a lot of work on trade, digital trade in goods and services becomes very significant and important. If Australia is not competitive in that area, we may be left behind by relying upon old conventional forms of industry like old agriculture and mining, which may not well be that sustainable into the future unless we kind of invent new products and services in various different ways, particularly in relation to information technology and communications technologies.
Yeah, I do find that we are looking at another part of the Startup Catalyst event. I've also found that they choose to be, they can't sell to their local market. They have to be an exporter. And as part of the connectivity in terms of people and the community, but it's also the infrastructure and how do they communicate to the world. So it is probably as important for us to have our local network and speeds there, but also have that connected to the rest of the globe, so we can export that knowledge, export those smart ideas to the rest of the world as well.
Our Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has complained that Australia does not perform as well as it might in terms of its commercialisation of its intellectual property. And I do think that he has a point there. We're very brilliant at developing research and undertaking science, but we perform less well in translating that research into real-world applications and commercialising that not only locally but also to the world. So particularly in relation to telecommunications, there are certainly kind of opportunities there for Australia to boost its performance in a variety of different ways, but being ingenious and innovative and developing intellectual property, and then using that in creative and prosperous ways will be advantageous to Australia.
I see that probably just as a last note, us selling to the globe doesn't necessarily mean that we forget about what happens locally. I think, especially in this information age, we can translate a lot of that stuff locally, so it's going to help us from a GDP perspective and selling to the world, but also to the local community. So, so just to close out, so thank you for your time this afternoon, and I appreciate the chat with you, Dr. Matthew Rimmer.
Thank you very much. Up and